The laughter reached her before the pain did. One of the young soldiers had clipped the edge of her cane with his boot. Careless enough to be denied, deliberate enough to be felt. And the old woman staggered just as the brown envelope slid from beneath her arm and landed in a shallow ribbon of rainwater on the parade ground. A few of them smirked. One looked away. Another gave a low whistle when she bent, slowly, painfully, to pick it up. Her fingers shook against the soaked paper. The name on the envelope had blurred, but not enough to hide the words she had traveled 600 miles to trust. Office of the Commanding General. "You sure you're in the right place, Grandma?" one of them asked, grinning at the faded army lapel pin on her coat. "This area is for soldiers." Before I tell you what happened next, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world listening to these stories. And if stories about courage, sacrifice, and humanity mean something to you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. She looked up at them without anger at first. That was what unsettled the quietest among them. Not fury, not embarrassment, just a kind of tired stillness, as if she had already lived through worse humiliations than a cluster of boys in crisp uniforms could invent before breakfast. Her gray hair had slipped loose beneath the brim of her old hat. Her coat was plain wool, too heavy for the season, and the cane in her hand made her seem fragile from a distance. But distance had always lied about her. If any of them had looked closely, they would have noticed that her shoes were polished to a dark, stubborn shine, and that even after stumbling, she settled her shoulders by instinct, not like a lost civilian, but like someone whose spine had spent years obeying command. Her name was Evelyn Hart, 78 years old, retired Army captain, widow, mother with no son left to call. She had slept badly in a roadside motel less than 10 miles from Fort Redstone and spent most of the night wondering whether she should turn the car around before dawn and disappear back into the life she had spent 4 decades building around silence. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier on thick official paper and signed except for a typed line from the command office requesting her presence at a ceremony honoring service, leadership, and legacy. No explanation, no personal note, no reason a woman like Evelyn Hart would matter to a place that had once taught her exactly how easy it was to be forgotten. At the visitor checkpoint, the young corporal with the bright jaw and the practiced impatience had studied her retired military ID as if it were a suspicious object dug out of a drawer. Corporal Mason Briggs, 22, maybe 23, the kind of face that still believed confidence and maturity were the same thing. He had turned the card over twice, frowned at the older format, and said, "This isn't what we use now." "No," Evelyn had answered. "It wasn't made now." 2 other soldiers nearby had laughed. Briggs had asked whom she was there to see. "The general," she had said. That had earned her a longer laugh. Not cruel enough to be reportable, not harmless enough to forget. "You and half the retirees in 3 states," he'd replied, waving her through toward the ceremony field with the kind of dismissive shrug that let him feel generous. She could have shown him the envelope then, could have let him read the command seal, the schedule, the time, could have asked for an escort, could have insisted on the old habits rank once made natural to her. Instead, she took the envelope back under her arm and kept moving. It wasn't pride that stopped her. Pride had burned out of her years ago. It was something more complicated than that. A private test she had not admitted even to herself. She wanted to see what kind of soldiers this place was growing before she stepped into the light. The rain had passed, but the morning still carried its chill. Beyond the checkpoint, Fort Redstone was waking into ceremony. Flags lifted and settled in the wind. Loudspeakers popped with unfinished announcements. Somewhere to her left, a marching cadence began, then cut off midline. Families moved toward the bleachers with paper cups in their hands. Children pointed at helicopters parked in the distance like sleeping animals. Young officers crossed the wet pavement with clipboards and urgency. The whole base had that particular look military places wore before an important event. Polished surface, hidden tension, everyone moving on time, and nobody really breathing. Evelyn walked slowly, more from memory than from age. There had been a time when she could step onto any army installation in the country and know exactly where to look. The motor pool, the flagpole, the headquarters building, the tired patch of earth behind some forgotten office where smokers told the truth. Bases changed. The smell didn't. Damp asphalt, coffee, cut grass, fuel. It caught in her throat. 43 years folded inward all at once, and for a moment she was no longer an old woman with a cane. She was a captain again with mud on her cuffs and a radio in her hand, hearing men shout through static while smoke thickened over a convoy road 3,000 miles from home. She stopped near a row of folding chairs arranged in perfect military geometry and pressed her thumb against the edge of the envelope. Inside it, behind the invitation, was another paper she had not let herself read since the day it arrived. A copy of an old unit photograph. 22 faces, most of them young, some smiling for the camera, some pretending not to. Hers was there too, smaller than the rest because she had been standing near the edge, one hand on her hip, chin lifted against the sun. Beside her, a thin lieutenant with nervous eyes had looked as though he still doubted he belonged in uniform. Daniel Reed. She had not spoken his name out loud in years. A gust of wind snapped the flags hard enough to make several people turn. Evelyn kept walking until she found an empty bench near the edge of the parade field and lowered herself carefully onto it. Her knees throbbed from the drive. The wet cold had gotten into her hands. She set the cane between her feet and stared at the soldiers moving across the grass. Young faces, straight backs, lives still mostly unwritten. One of them jogged past carrying a bundle of programs, glanced at her, then glanced again at the old pin on her lapel. His expression tightened with brief recognition, not of her, but of what she might be. He almost slowed. Then someone called his name, and he kept going. That, more than the mockery, touched something tender in her. Not cruelty, hesitation. The small moment in which a decent person feels the pull of conscience and lets routine win anyway. She knew that feeling. Most soldiers did. A shadow fell across her shoes. She looked up and found the youngest of the checkpoint soldiers standing there with 2 paper cups of coffee, shoulders squared with the awkward seriousness of someone doing something that might get him laughed at. He was narrow-faced, dark-haired, probably no older than 19. His name tape read Ruiz. "I figured you might be cold," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "They made too much in the hospitality tent." She accepted the cup with both hands. "Thank you." He nodded once, still hovering. "Ma'am, were you really in?" She almost smiled at the way he asked it. Not accusing, not worshipful, simply trying to place her somewhere inside the world he thought he understood. "Yes," she said. "What branch?" "Army." "I meant, what did you do?" A thin silence passed between them, filled with the distant thud of a helicopter rotor beginning to turn somewhere beyond the hangars. "I carried responsibility badly some days," she said, "and as well as I could on others." That confused him. Good. Life had a way of arriving disguised as confusion. Ruiz glanced back toward the checkpoint where Briggs and the others were still posted, then lowered his voice. "Corporal Briggs shouldn't have said that stuff. He's young. So am I." The answer hung there, quiet and honest. Evelyn studied him more carefully then. There was no performance in his face, only discomfort with his own earlier silence. "Yes," she said after a moment. "You are." He shifted, embarrassed by being seen so clearly. "Do you want me to walk you to the seating area? They've got a section for veterans. I know where the chairs are." He nodded again. He had the look of someone about to leave and then choosing not to. "Did you really come to see General Reed?" Evelyn looked across the field toward the stage being checked for microphones and podium height. "Once," she said, "I came to see a lieutenant. Time took care of the rest." Ruiz stared at her, and something changed in his expression. Not understanding exactly, just the beginning of it. He opened his mouth as if another question had already formed, but a sergeant barked his name from across the lane. He stepped back. "I'll come check on you later," he said. She watched him go and felt, against her will, a small fragile warmth enter the morning. One decent soldier did not excuse the others. But it mattered. It mattered more than institutions ever admitted. The ceremony was still 20 minutes away when the first hard memory of the past arrived without warning. It came from a simple thing, the sound of boots on wet pavement. Sharp, rhythmic, urgent. In another country, under another sky, that sound had meant the difference between motion and panic. Evelyn could see the convoy road now as clearly as if the base had rolled away and left it uncovered. The torn shoulder of gravel, the lead truck listing, the radio operator bleeding from one ear, the air thick with dust and burnt rubber. Lieutenant Daniel Reed had been 23, brilliant on paper and newly introduced to fear in its truest form. His driver had been dead before the vehicle stopped moving. The second truck had stalled. Orders were coming through broken and contradictory. Pull back. Hold position. Abandon. Return fire. Save yourself. Save the equipment. Save the mission. Every voice had wanted something. The road had only wanted bodies. Evelyn had wanted everyone alive. She had not succeeded. That was the part memory never let her edit. A little girl in a yellow raincoat wandered too close to the bench and stopped in front of Evelyn with the solemn boldness children often carried around old people in uniforms. "Were you a soldier?" the girl asked. Her mother, several steps behind, looked mortified. "Emma, don't bother." "It's all right," Evelyn said. The girl pointed at the lapel pin. "My grandpa was a soldier." Evelyn nodded. "Then your grandpa knows things most people don't." "Like what?" "How heavy a wet boot could feel after 30 hours awake. How quickly a promise could become a grave. How a person could spend the rest of a life remembering the sound of one unanswered call for help." Instead, she said, "That courage and being scared are often the same moment." The girl considered this with great seriousness. "Were you scared?" "Yes." "Did you do it anyway?" Evelyn looked at the rows of folding chairs, at the stage, at the envelope under her hand. "I'm still deciding." The mother gave her a grateful, uncertain smile and led the child away. Evelyn watched them until they disappeared into the crowd. The girl's question stayed with her. She was still deciding. Not about whether she had once been brave. About whether she could afford to be brave again. Because the truth was, she had not come to Fort Redstone only for closure. Closure was a word people used when they wanted pain to behave properly. She had come because some wounds changed shape with age instead of fading. After her husband died and her son followed him 6 years later, silence became louder. The house became too large for one heartbeat. Some evenings she would sit at the kitchen table with a dish towel in her hands and realize an hour had passed while she stared at nothing. Then the invitation arrived. Then the old photograph. Then the past, which had asked nothing from her for decades, asked everything at once. A woman from event staff finally approached her, all polite efficiency and distracted eyes. "Excuse me, ma'am, these front rows are reserved. Veteran seating is toward the back, near the families." Evelyn looked at the dozens of empty seats in front of her. "I'm not in anyone's way. I understand, but we're expecting distinguished guests." Distinguished. The word landed with almost comic precision. Without argument, Evelyn rose, steadied herself with the cane, and began moving toward the rear section. The event staffer thanked her and was gone before Evelyn had taken 3 steps. Near the aisle, she caught sight of Briggs again. He wasn't even watching her directly now. That made it worse. The first mockery had at least acknowledged her existence. This second demotion, to background, to inconvenience, to furniture that needed rearranging, felt colder. By the time she reached the back row, she was breathing harder than she wanted anyone to see. She sat, and for the first time since arriving, she considered leaving. It would be easy. Easier than staying, certainly. No one important had seen her. No one had greeted her. The general, if he had intended the invitation, could survive her absence. She could walk back to the parking lot, drive until the base disappeared in the rearview mirror, and tell herself she had been foolish to believe old ghosts ever invited the living in for any reason except one final disappointment. Her hand slipped inside the envelope and touched the photograph again. Under it was a note she had ignored for days before finally unfolding. It had been brief, written not by an aide, but in a man's uneven hand. "If you are able to come, there is something I should have said 43 years ago." No signature. None was needed. She closed her eyes. 43 years earlier, after the convoy rode, after the smoke, after the bodies were counted and the surviving men loaded for transport, a colonel she had never respected had asked her to revise her report. Not rewrite the facts completely. Just enough. Soften the language. Remove the part where a senior officer froze. Remove the part where she disobeyed the retreat order to retrieve trapped personnel. Remove the part where the abandoned vehicle became a coffin because command had delayed permission to move. "No need to ruin careers," he had said, tapping the paper with 2 fingers. "There are phrases that reveal the architecture of a person's soul." That was his. She had refused. The lieutenant she had pulled from the wreckage, Daniel Reed, face blackened with smoke, one eyebrow singed away, hands trembling so badly he could barely hold a canteen, had stood outside the tent while they argued. She had seen his shadow through the canvas wall. He knew. Of course he knew. And when the revised report was filed without her name on the recommendation list, and with enough ambiguity to bury what really happened, he said nothing. She had never forgiven that silence. What she had never admitted, even to herself, was that she feared this ceremony might ask her to. A bugle note rose thin and clear across the field. People began finding seats. Officers took their positions along the edges. The color guard assembled. The crowd settled into that peculiar hush large gatherings make before formality begins, when even children seem to sense that something ceremonial is about to happen. Ruiz appeared at the end of the row and crouched beside her so he wouldn't block anyone's view. General's convoy just entered the north gate, he whispered. About 5 minutes. She looked at him. How do you know? He glanced toward the operations lane. I asked. A corner of her mouth moved. You're not very subtle, Private. No, ma'am. There it was again. Ma'am. Not casual. Not mocking. Earnest this time. And with that single word, he gave back a measure of dignity the morning had tried to take. He hesitated, then said, I checked the guest list too. Did you? He nodded. Your name was on it. She said nothing. They had you marked as special recognition, he went on softly. No rank listed. Just your name. Special recognition. The phrase unsettled her more than it comforted. It felt like a category invented by committees when they needed to honor something they had once mishandled. Ruiz studied her face. If you don't mind me asking, why didn't you tell them? Evelyn turned the coffee cup between her palms, now mostly cold. Because respect that only appears after proof is not respect. It's embarrassment. He absorbed that in silence. Then, very quietly, as if speaking the thought might cost him, he asked, Do you still want to be here? That question pierced more deeply than any mockery had. No performance. No assumption. Just the one thing nobody else had bothered to ask. She looked past him toward the stage where the podium stood waiting under the pale morning light. I don't know. Before he could answer, a command rang out, and everyone in the seating area rose for the arrival sequence. Ruiz stood and moved back to his post, but not before giving her a look that belonged more to a grandson than a soldier. Evelyn pushed herself up with the cane. The general's staff arrived first, then the band, then a line of senior officers in dress uniforms that caught the gray light in sharp flashes of brass and ribbon. At last, General Daniel Reed stepped onto the edge of the parade ground, taller than she remembered, broader now, the years settling into him with the hard gravity command often carved into a face. His hair had gone silver at the temples. His gait was measured. Nothing uncertain remained on the outside. But when he turned slightly toward the crowd, Evelyn recognized him at once. Not by the medals, not by the stars, by the eyes. Even at a distance, they still carried the same old habit of thinking two things at once, what the room needed and what it was pretending not to need. She had seen those eyes in dust and fear in youth. Now they swept over the gathering with practiced composure. He greeted dignitaries, returned salutes, shook hands, took his place behind the podium. He had not seen her, or if he had given no sign. A hard little disappointment settled in her chest. The ceremony began. Speeches about legacy, duty, those who served unseen. The usual language polished smooth by repetition. Evelyn had heard enough public gratitude in her life to know how easily it could float above the people it claimed to honor. Yet Reed spoke differently from the others. He did not sound theatrical. He sounded tired in the honest places. He spoke of leadership as stewardship, of rank as borrowed trust, of the men and women whose names never made headlines, but whose decisions shaped lives that outlived them. There was substance in it. Experience. Regret, perhaps. More than once, the crowd responded with a stillness deeper than applause. And yet he still had not looked at her. By the time the keynote speech neared its close, Evelyn's pulse had begun to climb for reasons she could not fully name. Maybe disappointment. Maybe anticipation. Maybe the old instinct that told her something unfinished was moving toward her faster than she could move away from it. Then Reed said, Before we conclude, there is one person whose presence here means more to me than any words I've spoken this morning. The crowd stirred. Evelyn's grip tightened on the cane. Reed stepped away from the podium and unfolded a single sheet of paper from inside his breast pocket. "43 years ago," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "I was a young lieutenant on a convoy road overseas. I had training. I had ambition. I had no idea what real leadership looked like until I watched it choose other people over itself." Something changed in the air. The sentences did not belong to a generic speech anymore. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. A few people in the audience leaned forward. Officers glanced at one another. Briggs, standing along the side rope, straightened slightly, not yet understanding why. Reed continued. "That day, one officer disobeyed an order because following it would have left soldiers behind. She went back into smoke and wreckage more than once. She took responsibility that should have been shared. She paid for honesty with the career she deserved to keep. And for decades, the institution that benefited from her courage failed to name it." No one moved. No child whispered. Even the wind seemed to quiet against the flags. Evelyn's first instinct was not relief. It was panic. She did not want a crowd, did not want pity, did not want 43 years of private weight dragged into daylight by microphones and polished shoes. Her heart began to hammer. She looked down the row, then toward the aisle. There was still time to leave before the attention settled fully, before the names came, before strangers could watch her endure what history always claimed in the language of honor. She turned, and that was when Briggs stepped into her path. He did not do it viciously. That made the moment more painful. He saw only an elderly woman moving at the wrong time, someone about to interrupt the final segment of a ceremony. His hand came out in that firm, but careless way young authority often borrows before earning it. "Ma'am, hold up," he said under his breath. "Not now." His fingers closed lightly around her forearm. Evelyn froze. The touch lasted less than a second. But memory has no mercy for certain kinds of contact. Her body remembered the field hospital tent, the colonel's hand on the file, the career being halted with the same quiet assumption that she could simply be managed into silence. The cane slipped half an inch on the wet ground. Gasps rustled nearby as a few people noticed. Then General Reed looked up. He saw Briggs. He saw the old woman in the back row. He saw her face. And whatever remained of the ceremony disappeared from him in an instant. He stepped away from the stage so abruptly that two aides started after him before stopping. Across the open stretch of wet parade ground, in front of officers, enlisted soldiers, families, and veterans, Daniel Reed removed his cap, descended the steps, and walked straight toward Evelyn Hart. No one spoke. You could hear the distant helicopter again. You could hear the halyard tapping the flagpole. You could hear the tiny, stunned intake of breath from the people who realized they were watching a script vanish and something real take its place. Briggs's hand fell away as if burned. Reed stopped 3 feet from Evelyn. The years stood between them for one suspended second. The young lieutenant who had once survived because she refused to leave him, and the old captain history had tried to file into obscurity. His eyes were wet before he said a word. Then he came to attention and saluted. "Permission to approach," he said, his voice unsteady now. "Ma'am?" The word hit the crowd like a change in weather. Several older veterans in the front rows removed their caps without being asked. One woman pressed both hands to her mouth. Ruiz, at the side lane, stood so still he looked carved from the morning. Evelyn had imagined this moment in 100 bitter versions over the years. In none of them had Daniel Reed's face held that much naked remorse. In none of them had his salute trembled. In none of them had she felt suddenly, painfully aware that the boy she remembered had become an old man too. She answered the way training still lived in her bones. "You may," she said. He stepped closer, and for the briefest moment, he looked like he might embrace her. He did not. They were both too army for that in public. Instead, he lowered his salute and said, quiet enough that only the nearest rows could hear, "I'm sorry it took me this long." Evelyn held his gaze. "So am I." The honesty of it cut deeper than forgiveness would have. Reed turned back toward the crowd, but remained beside her, not above her, not ahead of her. "This," he said into the waiting silence, "is Captain Evelyn Hart, United States Army, retired. If you remember anything from this ceremony, remember her name." The applause did not begin right away. People were too stunned. The first sound came from somewhere on the left, a single pair of hands, then another, then dozens, then the whole field rising into a wave of respect that seemed to shake loose something old and locked inside Evelyn's chest. She did not smile. She could not. Her throat had closed around something heavier than tears. Reed lifted the paper in his hand. For years, he said, I believed the official report from that convoy was the truth. Or perhaps I believed it because admitting otherwise would have required me to face what my silence cost. Last winter, the daughter of Staff Sergeant Thomas Calloway sent my office a box of her father's letters and field notes. In that box was a witness statement never entered into the record. At the mention of Calloway's name, Evelyn's breath caught. Tom Calloway, driver of the disabled truck, husband, father of a little girl whose photograph he used to keep behind his radio panel. The man she had not been able to get out in time. Reed unfolded the page. His voice lowered. This is what he wrote. Captain Hart did not abandon us. She came back when she was told not to. If I don't make it home, let the record show it was not because she failed us. It was because she refused to choose herself. There are griefs that survive on accusation. And there are griefs that survive on uncertainty. Evelyn had lived most of her life with the second kind. Not because anyone openly called her a coward. Because the one man she could not save had never been allowed to speak into the official silence that followed. Now his words crossed 43 years and found her at last. Her hand rose to her mouth. The crowd was crying now in that restrained, collective way grown people do when something breaks open in public that they suddenly understand has been waiting to break for a very long time. Even Briggs had gone pale. He stood a few yards away, eyes fixed on the ground, no longer looking like a boy playing soldier. Just a young man discovering the distance between a uniform and the weight of it. Reed continued, but his composure had thinned. Captain Hart's original recommendation for valor was removed from the final record. Her refusal to sign a false account effectively ended her career. Today, in front of every soldier under my command, we correct that failure. An aide stepped forward carrying a dark folder and a framed citation. Evelyn stared at it, not fully understanding. Reed accepted the folder and opened it. By authority of the Department of the Army, he said, voice steadying through discipline. The record of Captain Evelyn Hart is hereby amended to reflect extraordinary leadership, selfless courage, and devotion to the lives entrusted to her care. He did not name a medal. He did not need to. The words themselves were enough because they were finally true. Then he turned one page farther and said, and because some kinds of leadership do not belong in archives where only historians may find them, the new Command Leadership Hall at Fort Redstone will carry the name Hart Hall. So every lieutenant who walks through its doors learns whom this place once failed, and what kind of officer it should never fail again. The sound that rose from the crowd then was not ordinary applause. It was larger, rougher. People stood. Veterans straightened. Soldiers along the rope line came to attention almost by instinct. The cloth covering the building plaque beyond the stage was drawn away, and there it was in clean bronze letters under the morning light. Hart Hall. Leadership begins where self-interest ends. Evelyn looked at it as if it belonged to someone else. She had expected perhaps an apology, perhaps a handshake, perhaps a private correction folded into paperwork. Not this. Not her name fixed to a building on the same kind of installation that had once treated her integrity like an inconvenience. Not rows of soldiers staring at her with reverence where mockery had stood an hour earlier. Not the impossible, aching knowledge that the road she thought had ended in obscurity had left a mark after all. But the deepest surprise had not yet arrived. A woman stood from the front row and stepped into the aisle. Mid-50s, dark coat, trembling hands. She had Evelyn's attention immediately because she was holding an old photograph in a plastic sleeve. Reed's voice gentled. Captain Hart, he said, there's someone here who asked to attend if you agreed to come. The woman moved closer until she stood only a few feet away. Her eyes were red before she spoke. My name is Hannah Calloway, she said. Tom was my father. Evelyn swayed. Reed reached for her elbow, but she steadied herself. Hannah held out the photograph. A younger Tom, smiling, in fatigues too big across the shoulders, standing beside a little girl on a tricycle. I grew up hearing your name, she said. My mother said my father wrote it in every letter after that mission. He said if I ever met you, I was supposed to tell you he knew why you made the choice you made. The entire field disappeared around Evelyn. There was only the photograph, the daughter, the dead driver's name moving through air again. Hannah's voice shook. He said a leader can't save everyone. and anyone who punishes a person for coming back twice is afraid of what courage looks like. My mother kept his letters in a cedar chest. I found them after she passed. That's how General Reed found you. Evelyn's face crumpled then, not theatrically, not loudly, just the sudden collapse of a muscle she had kept clenched for almost half a century. She reached for the photograph with fingers that barely obeyed her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I was too slow." Hannah shook her head through tears. "No, you were the reason other families got their fathers home." The silence after that sentence seemed to move through every uniform on the field like a command no one had ever formally taught, but everyone understood. Hannah stepped forward and took Evelyn's free hand. It was such a small gesture. No speech, no grand embrace. Just one woman whose father had died, taking the hand of the woman who had spent 43 years believing she might never be forgiven. That was the moment many people would remember longest. Not the general, not the plaque, not even the salute. The hand. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice had the raw softness of someone speaking through the ruins of an old defense. "He had a picture of you," she said to Hannah. "He showed it to everyone. Blue tricycle, bent front wheel." Hannah gave a broken laugh. "I still have it. I remembered the wheel. My mother always said that meant you truly knew him." I did. They stood there with the photograph between them while the crowd watched in absolute stillness. Some of the younger soldiers looked shaken in a way training never produced. Because training taught obedience. This was teaching them consequence. General Reed turned slightly then and said, in a voice that carried just enough, "Corporal Briggs." "Front." Briggs stepped forward at once, color drained from his face. He stopped several feet away and snapped to attention so hard it almost looked painful. Reed did not humiliate him. That mattered. Public shame might have satisfied the crowd. It would have taught the wrong lesson. Instead, Reed said, "Tell me what you see." Briggs swallowed. His eyes flicked once toward Evelyn and then down again. "A soldier, sir." Reed's jaw tightened. "Look again." Briggs obeyed. This time when he spoke, his voice was smaller. "A captain, sir. A veteran. A leader." Reed let the silence do its work. "And what did you see this morning?" Briggs could barely force the words out. "An old woman, sir." That confession traveled through the field like a wind no one could hide from. Reed nodded once. "That is why this matters. Rank will teach you procedure. Time may teach you skill. But if you need a uniform, a title, or a crowd's permission before you offer respect, then you are not leading anyone. You are just managing your own ignorance." Briggs turned to Evelyn then. "No one told him to." "Ma'am," he said, voice breaking on the second word. "I am sorry." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He was young enough to become better. That was the only reason youth was ever worth the trouble. "Next time," she said quietly, "don't wait for proof." He nodded, eyes wet now, and stepped back. Reed looked toward Ruiz. Private Ruiz. The young soldier straightened as if caught between fear and disbelief. "Step forward." Ruiz obeyed. Reed asked, "Did you know who she was?" "No, sir." "Why did you bring her coffee?" Ruiz's ears reddened. "Because she looked cold, sir." A strange smile touched Reed's face then, sad, grateful, proud all at once. "Remember that," he said to the entire formation. "Most failures of leadership do not begin with major betrayals. They begin with small, neglected kindnesses." He turned back to Evelyn. "Captain Hart, would you do me an honor?" She looked at him warily. "Depends what it is." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the crowd, easing the tension just enough for breath to return. Reed gestured toward the row of young officers standing near the stage, lieutenants due to receive their first leadership challenge coins after the ceremony. "Would you present these?" For a second, she simply stared at him. It was not the plaque that undid her then. It was this. Not being remembered for what she had survived, but being asked to shape what came next. Not placed in a museum. Placed in a line of continuity. Given back to the future. Her chin trembled once. "Yes," she said. The lieutenants came one by one. Men and women. Some barely older than the frightened officer she had pulled from wreckage long ago. Each stopped before her. Each received the coin from her hand, and each addressed her the same way. "Thank you, ma'am." "Honor to meet you, ma'am." "Ma'am." By the fifth one, the word no longer sounded like delayed correction. It sounded like restoration. The crowd never fully sat down again after that. The ceremony ended in a kind of sacred disorder. People lining the aisle to shake her hand, veterans removing caps, families leaning in close to listen. Reed remained nearby, but never crowded her. He seemed to understand that this part did not belong to command anymore. It belonged to time repaying a debt in installments too large for one speech to settle. When the last formal photograph had been taken and the band had begun packing up, Evelyn stood with Reed off to the side of the field where the grass still held the morning's dampness. Hart Hall shone across from them in new bronze and brick. The crowd had thinned. Hannah Calloway was speaking quietly with Ruiz a few yards away. Briggs was helping fold chairs, his movements stripped of swagger. Reed held his cap under one arm. Without the stage between them, he looked older, less protected by rank. "I rehearsed this apology 100 times," he said. "None of them survived seeing you." Evelyn kept her eyes on the building that now carried her name. "Apologies usually sound better in rehearsal." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That hasn't changed." "No." He grew serious again. "I was afraid." She turned to him. "Not on the road," he said. "Afterward. I told myself the truth would come out without me. That senior officers knew more than I did. That speaking up would only make things worse. By the time I understood silence was a choice too, you were gone." Evelyn absorbed that with the steadiness of someone who had waited too long to waste the moment on easy absolution. "It did make things worse," she said. "Your silence. Mine too, eventually." His eyes tightened. "Yours?" "I left," she said. "I told myself I was done fighting people who needed bravery on paper more than in life. Maybe I was right. But I also left younger women to walk into rooms I might have helped change." She looked down at her cane. "Regret rarely travels alone, General." He seemed about to answer, then stopped. The title between them felt suddenly unnecessary. After a moment he said, "Why did you come today?" She glanced toward Ruiz, who was now listening to Hannah speak with the stunned focus of someone receiving a story he would tell for the rest of his life. "Because I wanted to know whether the place that buried the truth had learned anything while I was gone." And Evelyn watched the young private nod at something Hannah said, watched Briggs pause in his work and look over, as if trying to memorize the lesson before shame could dull it, watched a little girl in a yellow raincoat tug her grandfather's sleeve and point at the plaque. "There's work left," she said, "but not all of it." Reed's eyes followed hers. He nodded slowly. Then, very quietly, he said the thing he should have said 43 years earlier. "You saved my life." Evelyn looked at him. For the first time that day, there was no crowd to hear it, no ceremony to sanctify it, just an old debt finally spoken plainly. "I know," she said, "and because truth, once spoken, often leaves room for gentleness," she added, "try to do something useful with the years it bought you." That made him smile through the grief in his face. "I've been trying, ma'am." There was that word again. Not from rank. From gratitude. By the time Evelyn made her way back toward the parking area, the light had softened. The wet pavement that had reflected her humiliation that morning now reflected flags, clouds, and the bronze letters of a building that would outlive every person who had stood there. Ruiz walked beside her carrying the framed citation she still seemed afraid to touch too often. Hannah walked on her other side holding the old photograph, as if neither woman quite trusted herself, yet with the full weight of what had been returned. Near the gate, Briggs was waiting. He stepped forward, removed his cover, and stood straighter than he had at any point that morning. "Captain Hart." Evelyn stopped. He took a breath. "I called my grandmother after the ceremony, ma'am. First chance I got." She raised an eyebrow. "She used to work nights cleaning a VA hospital," he said. "I never asked her much about it. I think I've been missing people while they were standing right in front of me." The sentence was clumsy. Real things often are. Evelyn studied him, then gave the smallest nod. Then today wasn't wasted. He swallowed hard and stepped aside. At her car, Ruiz carefully placed the citation on the passenger seat. "Will you come back for the dedication inside Hart Hall next month?" he asked. Evelyn looked at the building one more time. The name still felt impossible there. "Maybe," she said. Ruiz smiled. "I hope so." "So do I." He closed the door for her, then stood at attention without being told. Not stiffly, not performatively, simply offering the clean respect he had chosen before anyone explained why it was deserved. Evelyn returned the salute from inside the car. As she pulled away, she passed the stretch of pavement where the envelope had fallen hours earlier. The rainwater was gone. In its place lay only a bright strip of drying ground beneath the late morning sun. The same place, a different world. Honor does not become truth when it is announced. It becomes truth when it is finally lived. And as the base receded behind her, the ground that had first witnessed her stumble was the last place to catch the light. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that courage, humility, and simple human decency still matter, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. And if you felt something while listening, I'd love to hear what moment touched you most.